Thank you, Alicia, and thank you all for having me here today. Um, I'm excited to be here with you and want to let you all know that we're going to be talking about how we can bridge the digital divide through privacy, technology, safety, and confidentiality as we work with older adults. So let's go ahead and dive in. With the COVID-19 pandemic, we were all forced to switch how we did our services to make sure that survivors were still able to access the support and resources that they needed. Many of the programs we had been working with had already begun to look at providing chat, text, video services, and more prior to this time. However, now we all have had to figure out new and innovative ways to make sure that we're still in touch with survivors and that survivors can get the support that they need. While we may be chatting with older survivors via chat message, we're still survivor centered. Whether we're providing therapy through Zoom, survivors have the right to technology, and we have a due diligence to ensure that our communications with survivors are secure and safe. As we're coming down from the height in time, programs who rapidly switch to providing remote services have to now take this moment to reevaluate the digital services that they're providing. Is the need the same? Are the services you're currently still using the best thing for the survivors you work with? Have there been better changes and advancements made to other platforms that will increase your privacy and security? We know that with providing any type of digital service, we have to be mindful of all of the pros and cons, the good and bad, accessibility, safety, security, and privacy with how we as advocates use technology to communicate with older adults. Using technology, especially during a pandemic, to communicate with older adults can increase access to services, but can also create barriers to access. So I'm hoping that through this webinar today, we have a starting place to think about how we as advocates use technology to communicate with survivors in need, while also thinking about our confidentiality obligations. These are all questions and scenarios and things that we have to consider as we move forward. And remember, if you have any questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A or the chat box. Thank you. For those of you who are not familiar with the Safety Net Project, we were founded in the late 1990s. We actually just celebrated our 20th anniversary in 2020. So we were hearing from advocates in the field that survivors were coming to shelter, and back then they were concerned about GPS trackers on their cars, receiving harassing phone messages, receiving repeated voicemails, and it was out of this need that of what we were hearing from the field that our project was birthed. We work to address the intersection of technology and intimate partner violence. This mission has not changed since the project was first started. We work with advocates and survivors to help identify many of the needs that are out there. Some of the ways in which we do this is by assessing how technology can be misused, providing technical assistance, and working with programs on strategies for how survivors can use tech safely, how survivors can safely relocate, talking about data safety and confidentiality, how agencies can safely and effectively use technology. We also advocate with policymakers and tech companies around their policies and procedures. So, why is it important to learn about tech? Whether we are texting or TikToking, tweeting or emailing, chatting online or banking, everyone, including older adults, are using technology. And even if they do not have a huge digital footprint, technology may affect them. If they own a home and it's listed on a public site, if they have a smartwatch, or even doing simple internet searches. It's important for us to remember that whatever survivors are using, that they have the right to technology and should be able to use it in a safe and meaningful way. The misuse of technology is just another tactic of abuse. And if we are communicating with older adults, we have to understand the ways this misuse can put survivors at risk. Our data is everywhere. For survivors and older adults alike, the data-driven world we live in can create privacy and safety risks. I always think about my mom and her small digital footprint. And while she may not be as tech savvy or use the Facebook like she or the TikTok as she calls it, I have a large digital footprint. And we're connected through our shared car loan when I was younger, information listed on public PTA sites for our county, her home ownership, which is listed on Google Maps and Earth. All of this information could be ways someone could be collecting, storing, and sharing data about my mom, even though she's not doing the sharing. It's important that older adult survivors understand these risks as well, because they are the ones who are being affected by this type of situation. So, what does technology or tech safety mean to us? Again, technology doesn't harm victims. It's not the technology that causes the abuse, it's the person. And so we want to make sure that any type of tech, whether created for good or for nefarious reasons, does not harm victims. You, as service providers, know how to harness tech safely, appropriately, and effectively. I know today, and last week, I was working on this presentation, and my PowerPoint had glitches, and our IT department had to get on my computer, and I just was experiencing a lot of tech problems. I accidentally sent an email to someone who I didn't want to get the email. Well, think about what that means if survivors get an email that they're not supposed to get, or you share survivor information with someone through a database. Maybe you share a database with someone and they have access to their information. So our job as professionals means that we have to harness the technology safely and appropriately. We also want to work with older adults to learn how to use tech to decrease isolation and increase support. Again, during this COVID-19 pandemic, people were forced to not be able to see family and friends like they used to. And so we have had to really think about ways in which we can work with survivors to ensure that they are no longer isolated and that they can still have meaningful relationships with their family and friends. And then our last point is that offenders are held accountable for the things that they do. Remember, it's not the tech that causes the abuse, it's the person. And so we want to make sure that accountability is placed on the offender. Especially when we think about technology and how older adults use it, there are some barriers to tech. Many times, victims can feel like there is no accountability. I know even as a college student experiencing cyberbullying, I felt like because it was the internet or they were doing it anonymously, there was no way to hold someone accountable. Many people think that the internet and technology is still so new that there are no ways to hold someone accountable. But we have come a long way, and there are laws on the books that can help do this. I talked a little bit about this one, but it can feel for many adults that because they didn't grow up with tech, when we think about digital natives and digital immigrants, that this can be overwhelming or scary. Many times there is shame in wanting to let someone know that they are experiencing this. Older adults often feel like they should have the wisdom to know what to do, and this can lead to many not reporting these types of crimes. It is also difficult for people to understand just what happened. Technology misuse, especially sophisticated misuse, can make it appear as if the person doesn't know what they're talking about. So, when Safety Net first started, we were training on fax machines, corded phones, and police scanners, things you bought at Radio Shack. Remember Radio Shack? Technology looks significantly different than it did 20 years ago, and there are more technologies for us to think about. We have had to change our trainings when phones no longer were just phones, but now phones are little miniature computers. We are also thinking about devices that put us online, track our location, take and share photos, and more. There are many technologies popular today that many older survivors could have never imagined when they were kids. While they are usually exciting developments, we also see the unfortunate side of people abusing them and taking advantage of privacy risks or security glitches. Because technology evolves so quickly, it can often feel challenging to stay on top of it all so that we can support older survivors, especially when you consider yourself a digital immigrant or someone who didn't grow up with these things, and meet them where they are. So, we're going to talk about four principles that guide our work. Our first principle that guides this work is recognizing that technology in and of itself is almost never the actual problem. Technology is almost always being misused or manipulated as a tactic of abuse. This is important because the response to tech abuse cannot be solely focused on the tech. If we take away the technology, we're likely still going to be left with an abusive person and a slew of other abusive behaviors. If we want to support survivors, we have to focus on the abusive behaviors as a whole. Most technology being misused are things, devices, platforms, services. They were not meant to be a tool to harass, stalk, track, or abuse someone else. But abusive people will use what is available to them and unfortunately can be quite creative sometimes. There are also some technologies that seem to be meant for abusive purposes, but it's still someone's choice to use them. When technology is designed in a way that doesn't prioritize privacy or assumes that certain people, the ones we share a home with or share accounts with, are always trustworthy and should have access to our information, this can create privacy risks. The way technology is created is also a reflection of us as humans, so it can inherently have bias built in. Those risks are particularly concerning for survivors in communities that are already disenfranchised, underserved, and targeted. All this means is that it is extremely important for us to continue to look at design and implementation of technology and work to improve it so it's more accessible, more secure, and less likely to be misused. When working with individual survivors, however, we need to always remember that an abusive person is purposely harassing, misusing, or manipulating tech as a tool of abuse. And it's again likely part of a large pattern of behavior that has to be addressed for the survivor to be safe. Our second principle is almost as important because we want to recognize that even when the technology is new and unknown to us, it can still feel overwhelming and intimidating. The behaviors themselves are at the core the same. I think about it as new tools, old tactics, right? Tech abuse is about power and controls. It's new tools to harass, monitor, and terrify. Abusers manipulate technology so they can increase isolation, ruin someone's reputation, or make the survivor financially dependent on them, among other abusive behaviors. What this means is that even for those of us who are working with survivors, but are not really comfortable or confident with many forms of technology, this is something we know more about than we actually realize. Tech abuse can make survivors feel like they have no control over their lives or their future. In many cases, the survivor may not know immediately what types of technologies the abuser is misusing, but they know that the abusive person knows too much. They know about conversations, places they went, purchases that they made. Frequently, a survivor realizes the abuser knows too much because the abusive person will hint at it. They make it known that they are aware of something that they shouldn't know and that they have access to the person's life. This is on purpose to again instill fear and to be in control. Our third principle is to remember again, survivors have the right to technology. It's important that the first solution offered to survivors not be to get rid of their devices or close all of their accounts. Just like we wouldn't tell a survivor who's being harassed by their partner at work to quit their job, or a survivor who's being followed while they drive to their car to get rid of their car. This only empowers the abusive partner by disconnecting the survivor and isolating them more. Instead, we want to empower survivors with information about how to figure out what's going on, teaching them how to safety plan around their use of technology, and helping them think through how to document and preserve evidence if they want to. Technology is a necessity in our everyday lives, and removing it is not a feasible option. Doing away with the technology also unlikely will stop the abuse. As I mentioned before, it's likely just one part of the full picture of abuse. Encouraging survivors to get rid of their devices or their accounts may not only further isolate them, but it could also erase valuable evidence and worse, could trigger the abusive person to escalate their behavior. And lastly, We want to make sure that when we communicate with survivors, that we are making sure that however we communicate, that when we share and collect information about survivors, that it's done in a highly thought and thorough way. We have to have detailed policies and procedures if we're going to use technology to communicate, and make sure that we always ensure we are putting the safety and privacy of survivors before our service delivery and tech use, that we do no harm. I think about it like this. Even if it's easier on my job, does not mean that it's right for survivors. And so we have to make sure that even if it might feel easier for us to communicate through Zoom or email, is this the appropriate way for us to communicate to ensure that survivor information is not shared inadvertently? So we have to ask questions about tech. What the safety plan will include depends on what the survivor wants to happen. It'll be different for someone who just wants to cut off access to the abusive person and attempt to get away from them versus for someone who would like to see the abuser held accountable. We suggest asking about survivors how they use their devices, what technologies they have at home, and how they frequently communicate with others, instead of asking just about one or two platforms you're familiar with. Overall, as with other parts of this work, it's important to listen and trust survivors, even older survivors who may not feel as confident about their technology. Even if they're not confident, they are still the experts of their own experiences. Even if you haven't heard of a popular or particular misuse before, it doesn't mean that the tech does not exist and that it's not happening. So, with all of that to be said, we have now had our foundational principles, and we're going to take a moment to see if there are any questions. So, it doesn't look like we have any questions. We're going to go ahead and put our first poll question up. How much of an issue is tech facilitated abuse for the older adults you work with? Go ahead and fill that out. I'll give one more second or two. Looks like we have about 72% of folks who have answered it. So it looks like most of our folks think that it's been somewhat of a problem for the survivors they've worked with. Some people have said a huge problem, and some folks are unsure. Well, that's great. I'm glad no one said not a problem. We can go ahead and stop the poll. Great. So, yeah. So even if we know that survivors may not be using technology the way we think, that technology still could be a misuse for a feature. And so that's important to remember. Great. We'll go to our next polling question. What types of technologies are you seeing misused?
And for this question, you can either enter your question answers into the chat or the Q&A.
So, what types of technology are you seeing misused? It's a great one. Access to online banking. Yep. So maybe they're committing identity fraud. Maybe they're taking money out of someone's account. Great answer. Any others? Yep, social media tracking location, right. So maybe they've checked in on Twitter, maybe they've checked in on Facebook, maybe they have posted a photo with coordinates of where the photo was taken. Maybe they're using Snapchat and they have used to Snap Map. Yep, so social media tracking location. Any others? That's an interesting one. Apps like Cash App. So I'm going to take a wild guess and think maybe they're either having access to someone's Cash App, or I know in gig economy, a lot of times folks who maybe, so gig economy is like folks who do jobs like drive for Uber, drive for Instacart, do Instacart, maybe having access to their app to get access to their money. Or I know in other apps, it'll show you who your friends have given money to. So maybe checking like that. Another one, using text messages to get messages across if older adults won't pick up the phone. Right, right. So that's another one where we might see harassment. We might see multiple texts in a minute, maybe sending threats through text messages. Connected to clients' accounts for their own personal use. That's another one where we'll see someone impersonate the victim, impersonate like they are the survivor, and maybe getting access to their social security benefits, maybe getting access to their bank account. Maybe they are coercing them so that they can pretend they're the survivor and have access to their power of attorney. Someone says mostly online banking and using Amazon to order items with credit card. That is a good one. I know for many people, even in my own family, we share an Amazon Prime account. And mistakenly, I have had family members bill something to my card, and I have to go back and say, actually, I think you meant to pay for this yourself. But that could also be one where if credit cards are saved and you have access to someone's credit card information, you could rack up debt. You could rack up buying up things. Someone could do that. Another one, families exposing older adults to intimidating information on social media to increase dependency. That's another good one. So maybe it's around threatening them with outing them. Maybe it's around putting up fake news, or news that could trigger them to be scared to go out of their home. Maybe it's sharing articles that online that may be trying to keep them from leaving their house or accessing things. Someone else says targeting older adults via Facebook and Facebook groups to become a trusted person. That's another really good one that I've seen happen more recently when you think about romance scams and the ways in which folks will message on Facebook, oh, I'm a friend, or I know your daughter, or something like that. And then building the trust between them. If you're familiar with one of my favorite TV shows, Catfish, we've seen that happen where they will catfish the older adult, making it look like they have a love interest, making that having them send them money, send them gifts, bleeding them dry, taking their identity, impersonating like there's someone who's in love with them. That's another really big one. Thanks everybody for sharing. So this poll will be in the chat as well. How are you communicating with older adults now? So thinking about the ways in which survivors are communicating, but how are you communicating with survivors? And while you all are typing that in the chat, I see we had one more for our last poll: email and phone-based scams. That's another really big one. I worked for the Federal Postal Inspection Service, and that was one of the things that we saw quite often is where phone scams. Every couple of days, I'm sure you all are getting these too, around your extended warranty, or my other favorite one I get often is my social security will be suspended, and I have a warrant out for my arrest, and my account will be suspended, and the federal law enforcement service will come and arrest me. And they call quite often. So I see one person says agencies that we work with are calling on the phone more than ever, right? So we're doing a lot more of that, what we consider our old school, right? So doing phone calls are important, especially when we think about the demographic of older adult survivor who may be using tech. And thinking about many still have landline phones. And so they're using their phone, their cell phone, landline phone to call for help, to call and receive services. Any others? All right. Well, if you haven't seen any others, we're going to talk about a few other ways in which we see that communication happening. So, as the great songstress Olivia Newton-John says, we're going to get digital, digital. I don't know if those are the right words, but I always think about that song, Let's Get Physical, when I think about digital services. So, what does digital services mean? It means using tech-based tools to provide services to survivors who may be older adults. Like I said in the opening, technology can open doors for survivors like never before. We've been using tech to provide services since the 1970s, but we were using rotary phones, and then later pagers came along, and now we're using cell phones and texting, online chat, and video calls. These are the three technologies that we focused on in our digital services toolkit. We have to safety plan around information on the use of digital services for older survivors. This means that we have to be strategic, making sure that access is always at the core of what we're doing. Without access, the tools we employ are worthless because the survivors can't even get to them. We have to make sure that digital services meet the needs not only of the agency, but the needs of the survivors we are working with. And if they do not meet that need, then we will have to reevaluate what we are doing and find appropriate alternatives to this. When we choose a digital services that we are committed to, we have to be committed to the principle of survivor empowerment and survivors having the right to good services. This means that we're committing to making sure access, safety, and accountability are number one before we even decide on a tool to use. So we talked a little bit about examples of what digital services could be, but it could be adding text or online chat to your hotline. It could be video calls with survivors, video or web chat for support groups, and then email or text, and we have to do this with caution. So it's important to remember there is no fail-safe tool that will work for every survivor. In my agency, in order to communicate alone, we have so many ways to do this. We have email, phone, Slack, Zoom, text. That's just to communicate with each other. Think about this being multiplied exponentially when we talk about the ways in which survivors need us to be able to communicate with them in a safe way. Whether we go low tech and send a letter in the mail or go super high tech and send an encrypted email, each tool runs the risk of being intercepted, monitored, or tracked. Likewise, for survivors who may be living with disabilities, they may not be able to access the encrypted email with their assistive device. Or for survivors who may be older adults and live in a community that has a shared mailbox, maybe they can't get to their mailbox due to the health risks of the pandemic. Most importantly, I'm going to talk about many different tools today, and it's important for me to be clear in that none of these tools are going to meet the need of every older adult survivor. Many of the companies we have talked to have been open to hearing from us as well as from other like-minded organizations such as the Vera Institute of Justice. But though there are some who are not willing to change their systems. This means that we have to look at each and every tool we use critically and assess the gaps and concerns. Because we know that there is no 100% tool that will work well for every survivor, we're going to need to find tools that can be customizable and adaptable. We may also have to communicate with survivors on multiple tools, depending on what it is we need to communicate about. Lastly, and I think this gets to my former point, we're going to need different tools to meet different needs, and that's okay. It's our job not to know every tool out there, but to ensure that we give survivors as many tools as possible, providing as many options as possible, exhausting every last resource until we find the one that works best for each and every client or survivor we work with. All tools have some form of risk, even old tech. Old rotary phones ran the risk of being intercepted. Pagers could identify a phone number, and emails were not as protected as they are now. The risk to technology is not new. But what is new is how someone can, one, misuse technology, and two, barriers to the technology that are currently available. Try and think about the risks that are out there and help identify these risks for survivors so that they can make the best informed decision for themselves. Giving a list of what may go wrong up front before someone has had to share their pain or their victimization is important for building good rapport. Likewise, if you are the decision maker in your agency, you must know what these risks and benefits are. Your agency and the survivors you are working with depend on you, and you have to be able to articulate this back to them so that the advocates can properly talk about risks. And if a risk comes up or something happens, you and your agency have the ability to make quick but informed decisions in case of crisis. So you hear us talking about risk all the time. I think I spent a lot of time talking about risk. But we will talk about a few of these as we go. Some of the other risks to consider are interception. If an abusive partner intercepts the conversation, we all know that when a survivor decides to leave, it can increase the violence in their life, especially if the survivor is an older survivor or lives with a disability. So their personal safety could be at risk. If an abuser intercepts the conversation and people have to socially distance, what options does the person have when they choose to leave? It makes it hard for them to leave. Secondly, the loss of privacy is a risk because conversations can be intercepted, and the person knowing what is being said, plans being made, sites being visited could be risky for survivors. When we think about program confidentiality, there's been a lot of questions around how do we communicate with survivors using technology in a safe way while also maintaining our confidentiality agreements. It's important for programs to remember that whatever program we use, whatever platform or device we use, it won't be perfect, and that we should try to adhere to the strongest privacy and safety features as we can. Likewise, if we're hosting virtual sessions, ensuring that we are making every attempt to do so in a way that we are not sharing information, not only digitally, but with our family or friends who may be in the home. Then again, we have to think about safety and capacity of the advocates that are working, especially as we're home. How do we do this work where advocates are not put into jeopardy, but also remembering that they have to have boundaries? I know for me, it was much easier to set boundaries when I was having to go to work every day and leaving by a certain time. Now I kind of just wake up and start working and keep working, roll over and do more work. When we use technology to communicate with survivors, making sure that advocates have the ability to be off is important for self-care. So the bottom line is that most importantly, we have to offer as many ways as safely possible for survivors to communicate with us, and it means that we're being survivor centered. And we have to do so with access, safety, privacy, and security in mind. If we do it right the first time, we save our agency time and money, and it means that we do right by survivors. When thinking about digital services, we have to remind ourselves that though the actual act of providing advocacy may change when we implement a digital tool, that it does not change the core of our work. This means that the access is always number one and survivor centered is always at the heart. Our values don't change just because there's a pandemic or some sort of crisis. Remember, this is what you've trained for. We just have to do the work differently and definitely must do this strategically as we think about what this means for survivors. Whatever the tool, we have to keep the lines of communication open so we can continue to have conversations with survivors about privacy and safety while letting them guide us in how they would best receive the information we are giving. Survivors being well informed in language that is understandable, given the ability to test out products and offer suggestions, and allowing for survivors' concerns to be heard is all staying true to our core values. It's important to remember that just because the tech is offered doesn't mean we have to or should use it. Be critical of technology. Even though we are the safety net team and we talk about technology all the time, we are very critical of technology because we understand that there comes risks and barriers to tech. And once we as service providers have done a thorough analysis of the technology, then we can decide to use it. What's good for family calls, video calls, or chatting with colleagues may not be the most safest, securest, or accessible way to working with survivors. It's often the case that we want to use the easiest tool out there, but tools that we are already using because we know it may not be the best for survivors, especially older adult survivors who then have to learn how to use the tech. Lastly, use technology temporarily. We know that during these times, our main priority is providing critical services to survivors in need. But once we've reached a stable point in the pandemic, we have to reevaluate what we are using, making sure that we again are centering access, privacy, safety in mind. So first and foremost, and I will actually before I go on, I'm gonna see if we have any questions. Doesn't look like we have any questions in the chat, and don't have any questions in Q&A. Remember, feel free to ask questions. But now that we have checked for questions, first and foremost, we have to remember to meet survivors where they are. I hear this phrase used so much, but let's really break it down. It means to me that if a survivor says it is only safest for me, the survivor, to contact you on my cell phone, that we provide them with as much information as possible on the risks and benefits to doing so, while also giving them alternatives so they know that they do have options. Meeting someone where they are means that we're allowing for them to be wholly present in whatever state that is. So maybe for some survivors, it means because of my disability, I may need to use video to communicate. Or because maybe I'm older and my eyes have a hard time seeing, I use a screen reader. And that the best way to communicate is through chat so I can listen. When we offer a variety of tools, not only does it mean we're meeting survivors where they are, but it means that we can meet their accessibility needs better, as well as provide better services. We have seen a rush of programs who want to offer high tech communication platforms. But for many older survivors, low tech options mean less barriers to access. Many platforms and products require a download of the product, updated browsers, and a basic tech knowledge that may be difficult for some survivors to navigate and learn. Finding a tool that has minimal setup, no setup with clear instructions is going to be important. I think we've said this quite a bit, but remember to again offer as many tools as options. One of the things that I think is important is to test and retest. Even even for many of the webinars that I do, we do run throughs before we get there. Even today, I joined 30 minutes early. I tested my PowerPoint slides to make sure they went through and made sure that you all would be able to see them. We should never go into using a new product with a survivor that has not been thoroughly tested and then develop a strategy for if something goes wrong. If you're using a phone to communicate and they get cut off, what do you do? Testing before you actually need the product to do services will cut down on frustrations later and will give the survivor the ability to get comfortable with the technology. But even though we are talking about older adults, there's still benefits to many other folks, and many older adults fall into other categories. For example, many older adults live in rural communities and they may not be able to drive, and so they can maybe use Zoom to be a part of a support group. They can stay in touch with friends and family. And if they're in a home with the abusive partner, they may be able to discreetly text or chat with someone for support and services. So even if we are in crisis right now, there are long-term benefits for every survivor, including adult survivors, older adult survivors. This can offer new and innovative ways to communicate, provide services, but remember that the tool must match the need, and not every tool will work for every survivor. Some survivors will still need old-fashioned USPS mail. So what are some privacy and safety options? Anonymous use means that survivors don't have to download something. This benefits survivors who may have difficulty downloading because it's hard for them to understand, or they may have a disability, or they may not have strong internet. But it also means that it allows for them not to have to identify themselves, which could be dangerous. To build on that, we have to make sure the technology doesn't leave a trace on the device or account. If someone is being monitored and say that someone has access to their device, they may be able to see the nature of the threads or messages. Something that deletes or doesn't save after use can help cut down on this. While this may not mean an imminent danger for a survivor, making sure that companies do not have access to accounts, conversations, or threads is important. If I'm using a chat service and their rules are that they share every piece of data related to the client and service provider conversations with a subpoena or court order, this could put survivors at risk. And likewise, for those of you who receive federal funding, HIPAA compliant just doesn't cut it for you. I look at it like this. HIPAA privacy compliance offers you a lock for your front door. A lock can be a first barrier to someone breaking into my home. While it is helpful, a lock isn't as strong as my Ring security system. My Ring security system lets me know if there's smoke, carbon monoxide, a window has been broken, an intruder. I had to silence my phone today because every time someone walks down the street, it tells me someone's at your front door. I think of our privacy protections under VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, VOCA, the Victims of Crime Act, and FIPSA, Family Violence Prevention Services Act, as our security system. It's important for me to let you know that we at NNEDV, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, cannot tell you if something is HIPAA compliant or even if it is VAWA, FIPSA, or VOCA compliant. But what we can do is give you all of the tools and questions for you to ask vendors, and you can decide if the products meet this guideline. Advocates should be given all the tools needed to do their jobs effectively. This means that they should be trained before they begin to use the technology. They should know what to do if there are problems and set expectations. This is extremely difficult to think about as people are navigating working from home. The lines between being on and off are blurred. Even our advocates have a right to work-life balance, and when you introduce technology into service provision, you lose some of the boundaries that come when people have to commute or sign out for the day. We know that many times disclosure of abuse goes up when using chat or text lines. Using technology, there has to be a way for advocates to debrief and get support. If you're doing this before the pandemic, you should still do it now. And if you weren't, you should consider adding this to your staff well-being modules. So now we're going to dig into some best practices around how we use tech as a way to provide advocacy. Much of the content we'll review is available in our digital services toolkit. It can be easy for us to start taking technology for granted, especially after communicating a number of times with someone through the same platform. But we should be checking in each time with the survivor and making sure that this mode of conversation or communication is still the right and safest way for them. And if it is not the safest way to communicate, have other options available. Would it be safer to meet in person? Is it safer to have a phone conversation? Or perhaps they could reach out from another device. But, and this next point is very important, if they are concerned about monitoring and you've offered other options and they still want to continue, we have to respect that wish. This is about informed consent and decision making. If you've informed them, the rest is up to them. They know what's best regarding the balance of meeting their immediate needs and navigating any related safety and privacy concerns. So I said this before, we have to make sure we match the platform to service and the survivor. In order to match the platform to the service or survivor, we must first make an effort to talk to our community and get their feedback on what they've been using and what has worked well for them. Maybe you're working with a community that is rural and they don't have access to high-speed internet. This community may benefit from low-tech options such as a text or phone hotline. Maybe you're working with the deaf community. Using video services may be better because an interpreter can be present and help the survivor communicate with the advocate. The platform must match the service and the survivor, keeping their needs at the forefront. Sometimes it's easy for things to get messy fast when communicating with the written word. I'm sure this has probably happened to you in your personal life, right? You're texting with a friend or family member, and all of a sudden the conversation goes in a direction you didn't plan because somebody misunderstood something. We have to take time out to be thoughtful. And it takes time to have these thoughtful, curated answers, especially when we know meaning can be misconstrued in 140 characters. So the amount of time needed to do this is a factor. Agencies should think critically about how long they are able to have advocates allot to providing one-on-one services to survivors and the money it'll take to give it an in-depth level of support via chat, text, tweet, or call. There could be a delay in answering, and that may be for various reasons. So, as an example, a survivor could start texting or chatting with an advocate at 11, have to go to work at 12, and then may not pick the conversation back up till 2 or 3 o'clock. There may be a huge gap of time. And if an advocate doesn't hear from them, what will an advocate do? One thing I learned from working on our state hotline is that sometimes you won't get to know what happened to someone. In many cases of hotlines, chat, text, or phone, someone may end the conversation and you won't know what happened. That's really tough to think about because as humans, we want to see a resolution and want to make sure the survivor is safe and okay. But we must know that this is not always possible and survivors may just stop communicating. People often feel like they are safer to disclose more of the abuse that they've experienced when they don't have to disclose who they are. It feels as if there is a sense of anonymity for survivors. When these disclosures happen, making it clear for advocates that they can step away from the conversation, process, and then provide them support when they too must social distance and may not have the option to really leave work at work as they're working from home will be important. Many national hotlines also share that survivors have disclosed more graphic details about violence and incidents through text and chat. So, as we are providing support to advocates, we again have to remember about what these disclosures mean for advocates. Also, survivors may disclose their thoughts of hopelessness because of the trauma that's going on in the world. And we have to be able to support advocates as they navigate this difficult time and remember that the vicarious trauma is real. As you decide whether or not to go down the path of offering digital services, remember that the national hotlines are already offering text and chat. So there is somewhere for survivors to turn when they want to chat in the middle of the night. If you're operating your own hotline, what are some things to think through? We have to understand that while we want to be as accessible and available to survivors, if we do not have the people power to manage it, we can create issues for not only advocates who have to staff this, but for survivors. Most of the time, hotlines are for one-off conversations. We aren't doing long-term service provision through this. It may be difficult to get information around privacy and safety to a survivor. Likewise, we have to think about how texts or chats may be monitored via having access to the device or through some sort of monitoring system. As you decide whether or not to go down the path of offering digital services, remember that the national hotlines are there for you and you don't have to do it all. Are there ways that you can support those hotlines? And are there gaps to those hotlines that could meet your community's needs? For older adult survivors, it's important to find an option that will meet their need. How many times do we install something and then we can't find where it's saved? Or it says easy to download or install, but it requires your internet browser to be updated. It's important that we have clear instructions for folks who may need to download, install, or navigate a platform so that there won't be any confusion. Just recently, we hosted a TA call where we are utilizing Zoom's new interpretation feature. Well, we tested it and tested it again and thought we had it figured out. And so we got on the call and it required the interpreter to have to utilize a dedicated phone line, which wasn't clear. We then had to switch to using video so that we could make sure the call was done. This is a good example of how even though we thought the instructions were clear, they weren't. It can be frustrating and almost defeating for any survivor to have to go through so many hoops to try and get services. And once they get the services and decide to reach out, them not working. While text or chat can be great for initial conversation, it is important to develop a plan for ongoing advocacy. For some survivors, texting or chat may feel safer because it isn't audible and they can go back and delete messages or thread. Video offers more personal connection. And for survivors who may be older, who may be isolated, or for survivors with disabilities, it can be the only option they use to have face-to-face contact or communication. Video can help survivors focus in more and help keep them engaged. For survivors who may not be able to type or spell, this could also be a tool. Developing a long-term solution will be critical in developing a rapport and allow for survivors to have all of the information they need to make the best decision for themselves. So what do we mean when we say online chat? We're specifically talking about online chat software that is accessed through an internet browser. Survivors often access the service by clicking on a link that's available on the local program's website. Some programs use this to supplement their hotline, and some use it for both hotline and ongoing advocacy. You can see an example of this on the National Domestic Violence Hotline website. Before the chat initiates, survivors should be informed about the related risks of using online chat so that they can make an informed decision about if they want to participate. Once the chat has been initiated, the survivor and advocate then send messages back and forth to each other. Chat platforms can generally be a more secure option for written conversation than text or email, because with many platforms, when the conversation is finished, the window closes and the record of the conversation disappears. Chat is a great option because they're not stored anywhere. Advocates can use this method on their own computers and respond as needed. It's important, though, to let survivors know the hours of operation so that they are not waiting for someone. While the nature of the chat may not be stored, a browser history can indicate that someone visited the site. It's important to let survivors know this upfront on your webpage. This, of course, wouldn't be useful for hiding messages for someone whose device was infected by stalkerware, spyware, or a keylogger. But generally speaking, it's more secure because when the chat platform allows you to set it up in such a way that the conversation automatically disappears when the window is closed, which isn't the case with text messaging and many other app-based messaging platforms. When using online chat, it's important to know if the software closes the chat window on the survivor's device automatically when the conversation is ended. This is ideal because it's one less thing for the survivor to have to think about, one less thing for them to do to try to protect their safety and privacy. If the chat platform you use has the option to save messages or copy messages or backup messages, turn this feature off. Just as you wouldn't save or store hotline call details, you should not save or store chat conversations. And again, the less private information and personally identifying data you store, the easier it is to ensure that you are keeping victim information private and secure and upholding your confidentiality obligations. Issues with this that we assume survivors will have access to phones to text. But many survivors may not have texting options. For some older adult survivors, they may not have access whether their abuser is keeping their devices from them or their device may not have that option. Texting is convenient because most phones have the option already installed, but depending on what type of phone they use could depend on what options they have. It also is helpful because there is no need to download something, and you can stop and pick up conversations. However, some barriers to this is, again, you could be that somebody may not be able to text their answers due to either vision disabilities or that their abuser is nearby. If texting is the only way someone can reach out to your agency, offer the information for other agencies in your community that may be able to meet the need. We talked about this, so I'm just going to briefly highlight. Offer other alternatives instead of text that may be secure. Computer-based messaging is probably better than regular cell phone text messaging because, again, you can assign to multiple staff members and you can more easily protect confidentiality. For texting, it's important that we think about if a survivor device has been monitored. If someone is texting, is there a record of the entire conversation by default on their device as well as backed up in the cloud somewhere? And if they're texting using their native texting app, is there bill records that shows who they text? So there are benefits to chat, which is not texting, but the opposite of text is a chat message. And that is, again, that the conversations aren't stored on devices. Another benefit is that they oftentimes will auto delete and or close the chat on a survivor's device. The risk here, though, is, again, if that device is being monitored by spyware or stalkerware, that could be a way in which they are at risk. Some of you talked a little earlier about impersonation. So impersonation, especially as we think about ways in which survivors are communicating with us, is going to be important to think about. If we're talking to someone through text or chat, how do we know that we are talking to the actual survivor? Is there a password or code word that survivors can use to identify that it is them? Continuously check in with survivors to make sure that however you're communicating is still a safe way. And if not, develop a plan of action if this is not. So some quick thoughts about email. Email is not a safe way to communicate. It can be easily intercepted. Again, thinking about if the abusive person is their intimate partner, child, family member, they may already know the account password and may already have access to the devices. How many of you all, your intimate partner knows your date of birth, your mother's maiden name, knows your dog's name from 14 years ago, right? Many of our intimate partners, many of our family members know this information. And so it's important to think about that if we're using email to communicate, that this could be a way in which survivors are at risk, because oftentimes emails will back up on servers, they are synced across all devices, and it can allow for someone to get access to information because it can be intercepted. Many of you talked about phone calls being used. When we think about phone calls, we have to make sure that we're using agency-owned devices to make phone calls. I know this is a lot easier said than done, but here's the reason why. This helps provide boundaries, but also ensures that personal information isn't inadvertently stored or shared by accident. No one wants their personal cell phone to be a part of a chain of custody if there's a court order for data or evidence. Mobile devices can help advocates reach survivors using files from their office, sending and receiving emails, and more. Using agency-owned devices can also mean that there is better management of data security, with deleting regularly of text messages, logs, and bills, or the whole device, if lost or stolen, can be wiped. When using digital services, we need to remember that the device that they are using may be monitored. We've thought about this a lot in the way we design our websites, adding escape button, displaying warnings and information to help survivors navigate risk to searching for help online. And the same risks apply with digital services, but are amplified. Because in digital services, we are having conversations where survivors are disclosing information about their victimization and plans to moving forward, and often doing this in written form. So it's much different from being in person or even being on the phone in a phone call, because a transcript is essentially being created. These conversations are often saved by default on the device being used. And if they reached out through text, there's information that's on the device as well as maybe on the phone bill. Video calls can be important. We talked a little bit about this because video calls can be important and intimate because they allow for someone to see visual or audio cues. It's also easier to add in a third party, like an interpreter. Survivors who may speak a different language than the advocate, or who may be deaf or have other disabilities, they may be able to use video to chat. And it can also build connections, especially as we know that older adults are often isolated. When we think about group video or group chat, here are some of the pros and cons. For video, group video, members can see and hear each other. So when we think about support groups, but it also reduces the anonymity. So again, make sure that there are other options available. Can someone keep their camera turned off? For chat, you can have a set period of time for communication. And for those folks who may be living in rural communities or who may live in an area that's really populated and people are using the internet often, chat can be easier with poor internet connection. Chat platforms can generally be a more secure option for written conversations than text or email. Online forums for groups. Benefit is a private message board where survivors can share messages with each other. I've been seeing this a lot more, especially for older adults and for adult survivors, is using Facebook groups. They're making Facebook groups around the abuse that they've experienced. And that can be a really good tool in terms of sharing, in terms of empowerment, but those spaces have to be used with caution. Online groups should be limited to survivors and the group facilitator. You have to limit participation to only survivors already working with the program. Why? Because this ensures that the members are the right members for the group. It also minimizes the risk of impersonation. Remember at the beginning of the pandemic, Zoom bombing? This is one of the issues that people were thinking about with Zoom bombing. If someone were to get access, say, to your online support group and they're an abuser and they get into the group and they see that the survivor is there, or they know that the survivor has fled and now are working with your program, this could cause a lot of risk and problems for survivors. So we want to make sure that the group is limited to the people that need to be in there. Make sure that the group has a password before entering, and make sure that there are appropriate protocols and procedures set up in case there is interception or Zoom bombing. I think this is one of the most important points I can make. Older adults may be less likely to have access to the technology needed for video and may have difficulties in understanding how to use tech. For survivors who may live with their abuser, who live in group homes or communities where there isn't access to tech, there may be a barrier to accessing even the lowest of tech options. So older survivors may not have access to high-tech options, means of communication. Likewise, again, a point I spoke on previously is that there may be struggles in understanding how to use the technology. So being able to provide alternatives is going to be important with clear instruction. In the event that the internet fails, the audio connection will remain if we use phone lines. That's important. I know for me, whenever I use Adobe Connect, I always have to dial in by my phone because without fail, my computer will crash and I will lose everything. But I have found that I have to dial in by phone as well as by internet connection. And this is, again, important to test with survivors. So make sure that there's an audio option. Communication with the survivor who is using a personal or public computer have to be aware that their computer device could be monitored. So thinking about the ways in which that monitoring may be happening. Maybe when they communicate with your program, they only use their cell phone because they know that their cell phone hasn't been tampered with. And so maybe they only access emails from the cell phone instead of using their computer. Or maybe they use the computer to do light searches, like looking up recipes or looking up YouTube videos. Maybe they don't use that to communicate because they know that if they stop using the device, it could escalate the violence, but they're mindful about what they look up. So when we communicate online with older adult survivors, we have to do some things that I think we need to do quite regularly. How often do we have conversations and we think that we're texting something that doesn't have any weird or ambiguous meaning, and our friend or loved one thinks we're mad at them? What if I use 3 exclamation points instead of 1? Does that mean that I'm super excited or am I angry? It's often hard to decipher meaning and tone through chat or text. So it's important to make sure we're clearly communicating and checking in on the tone and meaning, especially for older adult survivors who may not be familiar with technology. If there's any confusion, we have to stop the conversation and address it. This is very important to ensure that survivors are able to make their concerns known and we can appropriately help mitigate them. I know one thing is true about working in the domestic violence movement, and that is we love acronyms: FIPSA, VOCA, VAWA, all of these different acronyms. We have to make sure we explain in detail what these things mean, and most importantly, just avoid using them. So earlier, you heard when I was talking about VAWA, FIPSA, VOCA, I said it out. I said VAWA, Violence Against Women Act; VOCA, Victims of Crime Act, etc. And then it's important to think about considering to close the conversation after a certain amount of time passes. If whatever reason a significant amount of time passes and there is no response, end the conversation and let the survivor know before the conversation begins what your protocols are if the call gets dropped. So these are all tools that can help you do your work and develop a plan for how your agency will be using them and what to do if something goes wrong. Make sure your IT department is up to speed as well. We hosted our technology summit this last July virtually for the first time ever. And one of the things that we thought we were doing correctly was we engaged the IT department. We tested again, and we still had technical difficulties. So even though we had engaged our IT department, even though we had tested, even though we brought in our interpreters and closed captioners earlier, we still had problems. And one of those problems was we didn't realize that Zoom did not record closed captioning in the recordings for later. And so we had done all of our summit, and our summit had 2 sessions a day for 5 days. And we got the recordings and realized that the captions weren't in there. So we had to figure out a way to put the captions into the video. Again, whatever we're doing, whether it's hosting a conference or talking to survivors, communicating with survivors, we may not know all of the ways in which the technology could be misused or there be glitches. But it is to say we have to have a plan of action of what to do if something goes down. When we're working remotely, we have to think about ways that we do this safe and effectively. So I said earlier, make sure we're using program-owned devices and accounts. If we're communicating by phone, email, video, or messaging, have clear protocols. What about file sharing? Do you all use Dropbox or any other sort of cloud sharing function to store client files or data? What's your rules around that? What is somebody's internet access? I've been asked to do several webinars this year, and many of those people have asked me to be on video for almost 2 hours while I do the webinars. And I have to gently explain, one is that while most of the time I'm okay with being on video, being on video is actually very draining for presenters and for speakers. And the same can be said for survivors, right? Like you have to feel like you're on. And so not only is it draining for me, it also, I live in what I would consider a very populated, nice suburban area, but there have been times this summer where my internet has gone out or my bandwidth has been shaky. And I've make sure that's why I have to make sure I'm dialed in on phone when I use Adobe. And so it's important to think about internet access, bandwidth, and Wi-Fi. Am I using a free Wi-Fi hotspot? If I am, what are the risks of someone intercepting that? Making sure that my home network is secure. Here's a suggestion. If you're using your home internet, don't keep the default password that comes with it. There are websites out there that scan for default passwords and will try to hack and access your Wi-Fi. And then, like I said, make sure your IT department is bought in, because you want to make sure that if something goes wrong, you have the right technology support. So Ultimately, before we start doing digital services, we have to make sure that we talk to survivors about risks before they get, well, maybe we can't do it before they get on the phone, but before they disclose anything to us, make sure they have all of the information they need to make sure that if they want to continue with the conversation, that they know what they're doing. We have to plan for safety and privacy. If something goes wrong, what do? We have to make sure it's still safe to contact. If the survivor suspects monitoring, we have to offer alternative ways to communicate. But if they still want to continue, we have to respect that wish. So we know that gaps exist. Think through approaches for older adult survivors who do not have access to phones or computers. Some of these gaps can be that they don't know how to access the service. Are the instructions for this clear? Do I have to download from my phone's app store? Do I have to sign up with an email? Do I even know my email password? Does my phone or device require the latest update? Another gap could be that their abuser lives with them. If my abuser lives with me and the only option you have is video call, I may be concerned with them overhearing my conversation. Maybe I live in a group or long-term care facility. That may limit my access to phones or technology. So I can't even reach out to help if I wanted to. This may also mean that I may be afraid or concerned about talking about privacy and safety in a setting where I'm being monitored or don't have access to a quiet private space. There's a lot of other gaps out there. And so think about what those gaps could be for the survivors you work with. So now that we talked about the tool, let's talk about the obligation. When we think about confidentiality, we have to understand what our legal obligations are. Am I a mandated reporter? Am I a victim advocate housed at a justice center but paid by the local program? Understanding your obligations and limitations with sharing and storing data and using technology means that, again, survivors get the best service possible. We get many questions about digital services, but often the same strategies apply that you've already employed regarding the phone hotlines. What if an abuser harasses us over chat? It's likely you've encountered this over the phone hotlines. So, thinking through how you've dealt with these issues in other contexts will be helpful. You're providing services because you want to help survivors find safety, privacy, and healing. This work is always, always, always centered in helping them make informed choices that meet their unique safety and privacy needs. The technology may be different, but remember, our core values stay the same. So, what is confidentiality? Confidentiality laws and regulations require that client information is protected. The technology should collect only the information you actually need. My motto that I live by, whether it's through knickknacks in my home, clothes, whatever that may be, is less is best. Less is best is also applicable here. The less data, information, personally identifiable information I have on a survivor, the less likely it can be tampered with, breached, or required to turn over or shared. There's always some questions around, do I need a release? Do I have to do this differently? And I think, again, we have to remember that the same rules kind of apply when we're talking about chat or hotline, is that whatever we're doing on our phone hotline should be applied here. So privacy equals choice. I think about it like this. I, the survivor, have a right to decide who knows what about me, even as an older adult. I think oftentimes, and I'm sure you all who have been doing this work much longer than I in your space, know that people often paternalize older adults. They think that because they've gotten to a certain age, they can't think critically for themselves. But when a survivor comes through our doors, even over technology, honestly, they're not obligated to tell us anything. They are in control of their story, and it is our job to protect that. It's not our job to judge them if they don't want to tell us everything. And if there are things they don't want to tell us, that's their right. The way service providers do or do not respect a victim's privacy can impact their safety and healing, because if we don't help them keep their information related to seeking our help private, it could compromise their safety. It could influence their quality of life, their chances of being re-victimized. And here's the $10,000 ticket. It's their information. And it may be the first time in a long time that they have someone who actually honors that and gives them the dignity to decide for themselves. Of course, it also matters to us because federal funding obligations, remember the three acronyms I told you earlier, require us to keep their information confidential. But I want to go beyond that. I want us to go with the spirit of what drives these confidentiality obligations, to remember why we do what we do. When a survivor knows you hold their privacy as a top priority, it helps build trust. They know they are at the center of our work and that our primary purpose is to be a partner with them on their path to safety and healing. They see that you understand the risks that take by coming to you for help and that you understand that privacy and safety are inextricably intertwined. By educating them about their right to privacy and informing them about their options, you, as a service provider, create a relationship based on empowerment. And by honoring that right to privacy, you also protect and validate their choices and decisions. So, some of the things that we have to kind of think about in terms of confidentiality, in terms of communication through tech, is data. Data everywhere. Data is our name, data is our age, data is our address, data is my favorite color. Data is anything about me. It's less about zeros and ones and more about who I am as a person. So it's important to think about who owns the data. Remember, it's the survivor's data. If they choose to share it with our agency, it's still in what we consider the VAWA circle that was created under VAWA. It's vital that in conversations with vendors, you get clear that the data is owned by your program. Entering it into the database can never be a transfer of ownership to the database company. Next, we have to find out who has access. Can anyone at the software company see the information you're putting into your database or your chat hotline that's stored or backed up in the cloud? Maybe you're conducting a Zoom support group and you've recorded it. Where's that recording and who has access? It's important to remember that Zoom or chat or Verizon or Twitter or whoever you're using to communicate is outside of the circle. So my colleague Corbin Street does a really, really good training on confidentiality. And they talk about who's in the circle and who's out of the circle. So you're in the circle because you're VAWA, FIPS, Avoca covered. But Zoom is not in that circle. We can't share with those people. Maybe we're on a task force and it has law enforcement, religious leaders. They're out of the circle. They're not in our VAWA circle. So it's important to know who's in the circle. And then we have to think about the cloud. What is this mysterious cloud? The cloud is where data can live. That's not housed in our agency. So for an example, I use Dropbox. Our Dropbox cloud is on a server somewhere in a state somewhere. I have no idea where it is, but it's housed in some random building warehouse somewhere. So if my data, my Dropbox information is shared on this cloud, does Dropbox have access to it? Is my information shared on a server with someone else's organization? What's Dropbox's rules around breaches and security? Confidentiality laws and regulations require that client information is protected. Technology should only collect information we need. So again, I talked a little bit about this, but what is identifying data? Traditional is our name, contact information, our social security number, ID numbers, a combination of demographics. Digitally, it could be our phone number, our IP address, username, combination of digital traces. And I think that's important to remember as well. And we'll talk about demographic data. So, some best practices for demographic data that we might have to collect is that demographic data may be identifying in combination or within small samples. Here's a perfect example. Say you live in a community and you live in a small rural community in the middle of Montana. and you are serving a survivor's family who may be from, I don't know, Haiti. And you know that your community has very, very, very few Haitian immigrants. They may be the only Haitian immigrants. If you are conducting surveys or demographics of information and you put in your quote unquote, I use this term loosely, aggregate data, and you say that you have 50% of survivors who are American, and 30% who are from Eastern Europe, and 1% or one survivor is from Haiti. So even though it is a percentage, it could still be it can still be a problem because it could identify that there's only one Haitian family in your community. It's important to make sure that our data does not identify someone. A lot of times funders want to have this information because numbers tell a story. They want to know who you're serving. But it's important for us to push back on our funders and let them know that we can't collect information like that that could be identifiable to survivors. And it's also important to, one, make sure survivors understand why you're collecting that information. I go to the store all the time. Well, not now, but I used to go to the store all the time. And one of the things that used to burn me up is when they would ask me for my zip code. And I would say why. And they would never be able to tell me why they were asking for my zip code. Inform survivors why you're collecting their information. It is their information. They have a right to it. And so maybe it's because your funder wants you to know it or have it, but let them know and then give them the option to opt out. Again, like I said, less is best. If you don't have it, you can't share it. Here are some best practices when we think about this. We have to always think about the context of our role and how much protection a victim has by the nature of our role. This role is going to differ if you're a case manager at a local program versus a civil legal attorney. For case managers and advocates at local programs, remember that to provide services, you don't have to write down every little detail of the interaction. You don't need to have a detailed life history. The best way to protect against harmful breaches of privacy and confidentiality is to not store the information in the first place. If you don't have it, you can't be compelled to give it. Delete as much as possible as soon as possible. With hotline calls, whether they are phone or text or chat, you aren't recording those and then saving the files. Those are anonymous and should be. Treat your other conversations that happen via written word in the same way that you would conversations that happen in the spoken word. This can also help avoid accidental sharing. If it's gone, you can't actually accidentally forward it. Minimize collection and retention. Delete as much as you can as you go within the constraints of the law and your funder guidelines. Guard against accidental leaks and develop a data breach policy and response so that you have a plan in place when it happens, not if it happens. When you think about companies, choose a company that cannot see your conversation. So like I said about Zoom and chat, choose a company that doesn't keep incidental data by default or customize the system to delete this information as quickly as possible. When we think about big companies, many companies collect, retain, and synthesize too much data for marketing. This could be problematic for survivors' privacy and your program's confidentiality obligations. We talked a little bit about this. We talked about the risks of using personal devices. If you're using a personal device, you don't want to make sure that your personal cell phone gets subpoenaed, and advocates have to turn over legal requests for information due to a legal request. And so again, using personal devices is going to be risky. Also, what if you have to fire someone and they're disgruntled and they have access to your information? Then what? So when you make sure that advocates have their own agency devices, you have the ability to tell someone what they can and cannot do on that device. Lastly, we want to make sure we're giving survivors their power back, whether it's through phone, text, tweeting or chatting. If they're communicating with us, we want to make sure that they have all the information they need to make the best decision for themselves and that they have the power to do that. We're not going to force them to give information to us. We're not going to force them to turn it over to anyone else. Again, reminding survivors of our obligations to reporting before they have disclosed, and making sure that survivors can be able to decide what's safe and what's a risk for them. So without any other points, I'm going to see if there are any questions, and I'll make sure that you have access to this PowerPoint if you would like to visit it at a later date.
Thank you so much, Rachel. We'll leave the chat box open for anyone who has any questions. We'll be hanging out here for a couple of minutes. Let us know if you have any feedback. You will also be directed to an evaluation following the presentation. Just a little reminder about that. And again, Rachel, thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'll put my email in the chat box in case anyone has any other questions and you're maybe nervous to speak up or don't want to put your question in the box. Feel free to send me an email. I'm always happy to answer any questions.
All right. Just another thanks from Nancy as well. Thank you so much for attending. We're going to close it out now. Thank you all so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.